Hello, and thanks for stopping by. When it comes to architecture, London is crammed with a truly eclectic mix of styles, with everything from the grand and ancient to the modern and controversial being represented, plus of course all manner of other bits and bobs tucked in between. There's one building in particular though which really stands out, and that's the Queen's House in Greenwich, which, with a history dating all the way back to 1616, represents a true cornerstone, the point at which architecture in Britain began to be regarded as a genuine art form. I'm outside the Queen's House at the moment, and as you can probably tell due to the lack of people here, I've turned up pretty early in the morning, and that's because, as part of my ongoing collaboration with the wonderful folk from the Royal Museums Greenwich Collection, I've been granted exclusive out-of-hours access. That means, as with my previous video in this series in which we explored the Royal Observatory, we're going to have this gorgeous and very historic place all to ourselves. It's believed the Queen's House owes its existence to a lover's tiff. You see, according to legend at least, at some point in the early 17th century, Queen Anne of Denmark was fooling around with a gun when she accidentally shot a dog dead. The dog in question happened to be a prized hunting hound named Jewel, a particular favourite of Anne's husband, King James I, and when James saw what had happened, he swore at his wife. However, the king quickly regretted his outburst, and so, as a means of making amends, he granted Anne the right to Greenwich Park. At the time, Greenwich was already home to a large royal residence, that's been the Palace of Palencia, which had started out as a small manor house, before being expanded by King Henry VII in the late 1480s. It was situated on the southern bank of the Thames, just slightly north of where the Queen's House is now located. Soon after, King Henry VIII was born at the Palace of Palencia, and in true Henry VIII style, he too later went on to enlarge the place, transforming it into Party Central, where frequent huge banquets were thrown in a custom-built hall. Henry also had a tilt yard laid out at Greenwich so he could indulge in his love of jousting, and indeed it was here, on the 24th of January 1536, that the king suffered a horrific jousting accident, the resulting injuries of which were possibly responsible for transforming him from a once affable fellow into a wife-beheading tyrant. Mary I and Elizabeth I were also born at the palace, and by the time King James I acquired the property, the surrounding area had grown to incorporate a park and hunting ground. It was within the park, close to a gatehouse, that upon receiving rights to the land, Anne decided it would be nice to build a small villa here, and so, to achieve this ambition, she turned to a fellow named Inigo Jones. Inigo Jones was a creative genius, and when it comes to British architectural history, his influence can't be understated. He was born in Smithfield in 1573 and baptised at St Bartholomew the Less Church, next to Bart's Hospital. His family had moved to London from Wales, and his father was employed as a cloth worker. Initially, Inigo was apprenticed as a joiner. However, it was clear he was also a very gifted artist, and when his skills came to the attention of a wealthy patron, he was granted enough financial support to embark upon a tour of Italy, thus blessing him with the chance to study classical architecture. As such, Inigo developed a love for both the ancient Roman style and the work of the Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio, who'd been active in the 1500s. After spending a period working for the Danish king, Christian IV, Inigo returned to England, where he took to designing theatre sets and costumes, primarily in conjunction with the playwright Ben Jonson, although it's believed the pair often came to blows over their creative differences. Then, in 1615, Inigo became the king's surveyor, and this, coupled with his work in the theatrical field, brought him to the attention of Queen Anne of Denmark, who in 1616 commissioned him to build her planned retreat in Greenwich Park. It's not immediately obvious today, but a major road, the Old Dover Road as it was called, which linked Deptford and Woolwich, once ran directly through this site. This route happened to pass right through the point where Queen Anne wanted her villa to be, and so, to accommodate this unusual position, Inigo Jones designed the house as 2 blocks facing each other across opposite sides of the road, which were then connected in the middle by a bridge-like structure. Similar, in a way, to some of the motorway service stations you see today. Initially, there was only one so-called bridge room. The second was added later when Charles II had the Queen's House expanded. The road, which was once sandwiched between the Queen's House, was rerouted in the late 1690s by the Greenwich Park Ranger, Lord Romney, and it now runs just north of the Queen's House, and, rather appropriately, is now named Romney Road. And the 2 long colonnades flanking each side of the Queen's House trace the path of the old highway. Sadly, Queen Anne of Denmark died in 1619, just 4 years after commissioning Inigo Jones, and as such, she never got to see her dream property completed. In the wake of her death, the project lay dormant for around a decade. Then, in 1629, King Charles I gave the unfinished house to his wife, Henrietta Maria. In the 10 years he'd spent away from the Queen's House, Inigo had completed 2 other major buildings in London, these being the Banqueting House on Whitehall and the Queen's Chapel beside St James's Palace, and he was shortly due to begin work on Covent Garden's Piazza. Keen to see the Queen's House come to fruition, Henrietta asked Inigo if he could return to complete the works, meaning she was responsible for blessing this marvellous building with a second chance. And as we're about to see, it's something history should certainly be thankful for. Inigo completed the Queen's House in 1635, and upon its unveiling, it proved to be an absolute revelation. It must be remembered that the Queen's House was completed over 30 years before the Great Fire of London broke out, and as such, it existed at a time when most buildings, as characterful as they were constructed from either old stone or timber, with thatched roofs being the order of the day. The Palace of Palencia, to which the Queen's House was essentially an annex, looked decidedly old-fashioned in comparison, and with its red Tudor brick, it stood in great contrast to Inigo's vision, leading it to become known as the White House, although Henrietta herself preferred the term House of Delight. Not only had Inigo Jones built a practical country retreat, he'd also crafted a true work of art. This, for example, is the Great Hall, which, as with most of the building, was inspired by Italian Palladian architecture, meaning symmetry is everything. The Great Hall is located on the northern side of the Queen's House, and Inigo designed it as a 40-foot cube with a wooden gallery. The gallery's balcony, which is forged from oak, is original early 17th century. It was carved by craftsmen from Woolwich Dockyard, who at the same time were also toiling away on Charles I's flagship, the Sovereign of the Seas. The ceiling's beams, which are fashioned from pine, are also original, and when first put in place, they were painted white and gold, the colours of the French monarchy, which is appropriate considering Henrietta Maria had been born into the French royal family. Down below, the Great Hall's magnificent floor, which as you can see is also geometrically perfect, dates from the 1630s too. It's made from marble, white from Italy, and black from Belgium. Henrietta Maria ensured the new house was luxuriously furnished. One visitor noted that it far surpasseth all other of that kind in England. And like her husband Charles, she was a great patron of the arts, leading her to commission an array of works from the era's leading artists to decorate her new abode. As such, the Great Hall would have once been dotted with numerous statues, and had you been standing here in the 1630s or 40s and looked up, you would have seen a spectacular artwork comprised of 9 panels, which is created by the Italian artist Orazio Gentischelli. When working on this masterpiece, which is named An Allegory of Peace and the Arts, Orazio was in poor health and nearing the end of his life. He died in London in 1639. Because of this, it's believed he shared much of the work with his daughter, Artemisia, who was a sought-after artist in her own right. As you can see though, the panels are now empty, and that's because in 1708 they were removed by Queen Anne of England and gifted to her close friend and advisor, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, who had them installed in Marlborough House in St James's, where they remain to this day. Unfortunately though, not long after sending this generous present, the two women had a big falling out, which no doubt left Anne somewhat miffed that she'd given such a treasure away. The empty panels were redecorated in 2016 with a rather splendid gold leaf design by the Turner Prize-winning artist Richard Wright, who, along with his team, used the same techniques which would have been employed by 17th century artisans. Intended to reflect the geometry and symmetry of the Queen's house, Richard incorporated a tulip motif into the delicate design, the reason for which we shall now move on to. Alongside the Great Hall, the most stunning aspect of the Queen's house are the Tulip Stairs, which really do have to be seen to be believed. They're simply breathtaking. Designed by Inigo Jones as a cantilevered staircase, believed to be the first stone example of which ever seen in Britain, the steps require no other support, which no doubt made early visitors here somewhat apprehensive to use at first. Interestingly, there are no rest points on the stairs, even though at the time it was common to incorporate alcoves with little benches, as climbing a staircase, particularly if you were wearing a long heavy dress, could prove hard going. Because of the absence of such rest points, it's believed Inigo intended this staircase mainly for show. In other words, after being presented on the balcony, he figured most people would be walking down it towards the Great Hall, as part of a stunning entrance, which, considering his background in the theatre, would certainly seem to make sense. This spiral masterpiece has been known as the Tulip Stairs since the 1690s. They gained the name when a blacksmith, who'd been working on them, sent an invoice, in which he alluded to them as the Tulip Stairs, a reference to the pattern forged in the wrought iron railings. However, it would seem the blacksmith was mistaken, for it's believed the little patterns incorporated into the design were in fact meant to represent lilies, those being the royal flower of France, which, like the white and gold paint on the Great Hall's balcony mentioned earlier, are a reference to Henrietta Maria's French heritage. Despite this though, the blacksmith tulip nickname stuck. Now, if you're easily creeped out, it may be best if you skip this next bit, as I'm about to show you a rather spooky picture. This eerie image was taken in 1966 on the Tulip Stairs by the Canadian Reverend Ralph Hardy, who was on holiday with his wife, and it's widely regarded to be one of London's most infamous ghost photographs. Mr. and Mrs. Hardy were adamant that, when this photo was snapped, nobody else was in the area, certainly not on the stairs, and that the ghostly figure, or were there two, or even three, were only discovered when the pictures were developed back in Canada. The eerie anomaly apparent in Reverend Hardy's ghostly photo has never been fully explained, despite being examined by experts from Kodak, who confirmed no tampering had taken place. Yeah, as wonderful as it is to have the empty Queen's house all to myself, I'm now beginning to think that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Let's move on. Despite its connections with the monarchy, the Queen's house managed to survive the English Civil War unscathed. Most of the original artworks, however, which had been commissioned by Henrietta Maria, were sold off during this period, meaning little is known about the early pieces housed here. The only surviving artwork from the early days of the Queen's house can be seen on the ceiling of the Queen's bedchamber, an incredible piece which is believed to have been painted by Edward Pearce Sr., who'd collaborated with Inigo Jones on other projects. Despite losing so many early pieces, the Queen's house has since become a major gallery in its own right, being home to over 450 artworks, one of the most famous being the Armada portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, which, dating from 1588, was curated by an unknown artist. Another magnificent item is this huge tapestry entitled The Burning of the Royal James at the Battle of Solbay, a depiction of the battle which took place between the English and the Dutch off the Suffolk coast in 1672. The design was drafted in around 1674 by the leading Dutch marine artist Wilhelm van der Velde the Elder, who'd witnessed the sea battle firsthand. And it appears here in this photograph, in which young Queen Elizabeth II can be seen. The tapestry has undergone a recent major restoration, allowing it to be put back on public display for the first time in over 20 years. Van der Velde, and his son Van der Velde the Younger, who also specialised in marine art, and whose paintings would later inspire Turner, worked within the Queen's house itself, having been granted a room for a studio by Charles II, and the Royal Museums Greenwich Collection currently have an atmospheric recreation of their studio on display in that very same room. Following the end of Cromwell's tyrannical reign and the restoration of the monarchy, which took place in 1660 when Charles II came to the throne, Charles's mother, Henrietta Maria, also returned from exile, and in anticipation of this, her son had the Queen's house greatly expanded to contain more rooms, creating the layout we see today. Despite all of this work being done, which included various bedrooms and royal reception rooms being added, Henrietta Maria would only end up living here for a few months, and in fact was the only queen to ever call the building home. The next queen to own the property was Mary II, and it was during her tenure that the large complex, now known as the Old Royal Naval College, was built on the site of the former Palace of Valencia, which had been demolished in the 1660s. Originally built as a hospital, Mary asked the architect, one Sir Christopher Wren, to ensure that the view of the Queen's house be left unhindered and visible from the Thames. A wise aesthetic choice which remains in place to this day. The final queen associated with the house was Queen Anne of England, who ruled between 1702 and 1714, and who, as we saw earlier, was a little too hasty in giving away the paintings which once adorned the ceiling of the Great Hall. By this point, the monarchy had started to distance itself from Greenwich, and as such the Queen's house found a new role, providing a home for royal servants and Greenwich Park Rangers. John Flamsteed, the very first astronomer royal, also resided here for a period, whilst a nearby Royal Observatory was being built. By the start of the 19th century, the Queen's house had fallen into some disrepair, leading King George III to hand it over to the newly established Royal Naval Asylum, which was in fact a boarding school for orphans, specifically the sons and daughters of men who'd served at sea. It's for this reason that part of the Queen's house is now labelled the Headmaster's Residence. After over 120 years, the school vacated the building in 1933, soon after which the Queen's house underwent a major renovation and restoration, initially as part of the neighbouring National Maritime Museum. This incredible building has been open to the public ever since, and in recent years it's appeared in a variety of films and TV shows, including Bridgerton, The Crown, and Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows. Best of all, entry to the Queen's house is free. So, if you happen to find yourself in Greenwich, do be sure to pop by for a visit. You won't be disappointed. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this out-of-hours look around the Queen's house, and would love to hear your own thoughts on this beautiful building. Have you had the chance to visit it yourself? And what do you make of the Tulip Stairs ghost? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thanks again too to the wonderful staff from the Royal Greenwich Museums Collection for inviting me to film at the Queen's house. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.